If I had realized that owning a lake would lead to a showdown with a clipboard-wielding woman on a power trip, I probably would have bought a chunk of desert instead. She came charging across my land like she was starring in a reality show about hoe tyrants. She wore a red blazer with a DIY hoe logo and carried the self-righteous air of someone who once led a PTA mutiny that made the local papers. "You're breaking the community fishing rules," she hollered at me, right there on my own land, with my fish looking as baffled as I felt. And that's how I met Shelley Va, a part-time wellness enthusiast, full-time neighborhood despot. What followed was a bizarre saga of bogus fines, pool test strips, local news coverage, and a conclusion so satisfying it ought to be illegal. If an hoe has ever tried to invade your backyard, I'd love to hear about it. Grab the popcorn, I'm bringing the drama. Picture a perfect morning in the Texas Hill Country. I'd been living on my 50-acre ranch for 2 years, ever since I ditched the corporate grind to start my nature podcast. The sun was just peeking over the horizon, turning my private lake into a shimmering pool of gold and bronze. I had my favorite coffee mug in one hand and my trusty fishing rod in the other, enjoying the kind of peace I'd always dreamed of. The bass were biting, the water was calm, and life felt exactly as it should. I was on my own dock, fishing in the pure stillness of the morning, when Shelley made her dramatic entrance. I heard her shrill voice before I even saw her cutting through the calm like a buzzsaw through velvet. Excuse me, sir," she barked. I turned around and saw this woman striding across my property as if she had a deed to the land. She had that infamous Karen haircut, a sharp, choppy blonde bob that practically demanded to speak to a manager. Her red blazer, homemade hoe patch, and overinflated sense of authority were all on display. She looked like she'd fired her stylist and hired a crossing guard instead. Her bright red talons and nails so long I wondered how she wrote anything that jabbed in my direction. "You need to stop fishing right now," she declared. "You don't have the right permits for this waterway." I couldn't help but chuckle at first, thinking she must be joking. Who barges onto someone's property at dawn to demand fishing permits? But her face was stone serious, and it was clear she truly believed she could tell me what to do on my own land. I set down my coffee and explained as calmly as I could that this was my property. I owned the lake, and I had every document to prove it. Shelley didn't want to hear it. She whipped out a laminated badge that looked like a craft project from a kid's art class. "I'm the lake safety officer for this community," she announced, flashing it like she was in the FBI. "You're in violation of several environmental codes." The situation was so bizarre, I had to resist the urge to laugh out loud. There she was at dawn, trying to fine me for fishing on my own lake. She started snapping photos of me with her phone like I was an eco-criminal documenting my fishing rod, my coffee mug, probably even my slippers for evidence. Then she reached into her clipboard and triumphantly produced a handwritten citation that looked like a shopping list. $500 for illegal fishing in protected waters, she declared, tearing it off and thrusting it at me. Looking at that scribbled note, I realized I was dealing with someone who'd completely lost her grip on reality. But rather than get angry, I felt this strange calm wash over me. Maybe it was the peaceful morning air or the sheer ridiculousness of the situation, but I just smiled and said, "I'll look into it." The self-satisfied smirk on her face told me she thought she'd scored a major victory. As soon as she strutted away, I headed to my shed and grabbed a piece of plywood and some paint. Within an hour, I had a fresh new sign posted at the edge of my property: "Corns not welcome." If Shelley wanted to play games, I was ready to join in. Little did I know that was only the opening move in what would become the wildest property battle in Texas history. As I settled back into fishing, I couldn't help but wonder what kind of person wakes up and decides to harass their neighbor over imaginary rules. I was about to find out just what kind of person Shelley Voss really was. I thought the clipboard crusader would vanish after our first encounter, but I was dead wrong. The very next morning, my phone rang at 7 sharp. It was Roy Garrison, the HOA secretary, and he sounded like he was reading a hostage note. "Mr. Morgan," he said, his voice trembling, "I'm really sorry, but Shelley has scheduled an environmental inspection of your property this afternoon. I just wanted to give you a heads up because, Well, a broken bar. I think this whole thing is spiraling out of control. I could hear it in his tone. He knew this was nuts, but he was too scared of Shelley to say anything more. Around 2 in the afternoon, the traveling circus rolled in. Shelley pulled up in a broken bar. Shelley pulled up in her battered old Honda Civic, with Roy following reluctantly in his pickup, looking like he'd rather be anywhere but here. But the real showstopper was how Shelley had dressed for the occasion, like she was about to enter a biohazard zone. She wore bright yellow rain boots that probably cost more than Roy's entire truck, rubber gloves that reached her elbows, and what looked like a shower curtain she turned into a hazmat suit. She even brought along a plastic toolbox that seemed better suited for pool maintenance than any serious investigation. The whole setup was so absurd I couldn't resist filming it from my kitchen window. Roy had a measuring tape and a clipboard that looked stuffed with official-looking forms, but his slumped shoulders and constant glances in my direction said it all. He wanted nothing to do with this. Shelley, on the other hand, was in her element, waving around those little pool test strips like she was heading a groundbreaking environmental study. She dipped them into my lake, scrutinizing each one like it might hold the secrets of the universe. Every time she pulled a strip from the water, she'd hold it up dramatically to the light and scribble notes in her clipboard with the intensity of someone working for NASA. But things took an even more bizarre turn when Shelley pulled out her phone and started recording herself. I watched through my window as she launched into a social media monologue, talking to her camera like she was the leading expert on environmental disasters. "What I'm discovering here is deeply alarming," she told her phone, brandishing a pool test strip like it was evidence in a high-profile investigation. "The contamination levels are unlike anything I've seen in my professional career." Professional career? The last I heard, she was selling confidence courses online. She was clearly just putting on a show for her community page, narrating her fake inspection as if she'd stumbled onto a major environmental scandal. Bob Williams, one of my neighbors, happened to stroll by during this performance and couldn't help himself. "Ma'am," he called out, "why are you testing that lake like it's a urine sample?" The expression on Shelley's face when someone finally called her out was priceless. She tried to launch into some convoluted explanation about advanced environmental testing methods, but Bob just shook his head and kept walking, muttering something about these crazy HOA types. The whole thing was so ridiculous, I decided to keep recording from my window. I figured this footage would come in handy eventually. Watching her try to take professional water samples was comedy gold. She was using small plastic bottles like the ones kids take to school for juicia and mumbling about contamination levels and dangerous chemicals as she filled them up. Roy stood about 10 feet away, clearly wishing the earth would swallow him up. A few more neighbors wandered over, drawn in by the commotion. Shelley was quick to launch into her dramatic speech, warning them how my fishing was supposedly endangering the entire community's water supply. My neighbors looked confused, and rightly so. After nearly an hour of this absurd display, Shelley stomped up to my front door and rang the bell like she had a warrant. When I opened the door, she was practically vibrating with self-importance. "The preliminary findings are worse than I feared," she said, waving her test strips like they were smoking guns. "Your fishing has created hazardous contamination levels, endangering our entire community. I'm issuing an immediate citation of $750 for ongoing environmental violations and damage to protected waterways." She handed me another one of her handwritten tickets, this one even more elaborate than the first, complete with checkboxes and official-sounding jargon that was pure nonsense. That evening, I got a knock on the door from Nora Whitman, my 70-year-old neighbor who'd lived here for 15 years. She had a plate of homemade cookies and a knowing smile that told me she was about to spill some serious tea. "Honey," she said, settling into my kitchen like we were old friends, "I've been watching that woman's circus all day, and you need to know what you're up against." Nora proceeded to lay out the story of Shelley's past, how she'd shown up about a year ago after her online coaching gig tanked. Apparently, Shelley had been selling confidence seminars and promising life transformations for $99 a month. When that fell apart, she muscled her way into the HOA presidency by promising to whip the community into shape. Nora told me I wasn't the first target. Shelley had already bullied 2 other families with these fake violations, and both had just paid up to avoid the drama. "But," Nora said, eyes twinkling, Something tells me you're not the type to back down. That night, I went to bed plotting my next move, with Nora's words echoing in my mind about how this neighborhood used to have a pond somewhere, a broken bar. 20 years ago, she said a small detail that was about to become incredibly important. That night, Nora shared something that changed everything. "Honey, there used to be a community pond 20 years ago." Those words kept echoing in my mind as I lay in bed, turning them over and over. If there had been an actual community pond once, where had it gone? And why was Shelley laying claim to my private lake instead of whatever happened to that original community water? I had a strong hunch that getting to the bottom of this mystery would be just the leverage I needed to flip this whole situation around. The next morning, I called up Nora and asked if she'd help me do some digging at the community center. She was absolutely delighted at the chance to expose Shelley Voss and her nonsense. So we met up after lunch and headed over. The community center had this dusty old archive room filled with decades of records and minutes from home meetings, property files, and photo albums chronicling community events. Walking into that room felt like traveling back in time. The air was thick with the scent of aging paper and mothballs, and dusty beams of light filtered in through grimy windows. Cardboard boxes were stacked from floor to ceiling, each filled with the bureaucratic history of a small town. Nora knew exactly where to look. She pulled out a creaky wooden ladder that probably hadn't been moved in years. "The good stuff is always up top," she said, climbing up with the energy of someone half her age. She started handing down box after box, each labeled with faded marker, 1995, 2000, 2005. Each was time capsule of neighborhood drama, minutes typed on actual typewriters, smudged newsletters, and blurry photos from block parties long gone. We spread everything out on a folding table under a flickering fluorescent light, sifting through it all like archaeologists on a dig. Within an hour, we struck gold. In the minutes from 2003, there it was. Motion to approve filling of community pond for Phase 3 residential development. Motion carried unanimously, but the real jackpot was in the photo albums. Nora pulled out bright color photos from the 80s and 90s, showing the pond in all its former glory, kids fishing from a wooden dock, families picnicking on the banks, everyone smiling and happy. "This was the heart of our community," Nora said softly, running her finger over a photo of kids feeding ducks. "Everybody knew everybody back then because we all came down here." The old photos told the story. A beautiful pond about 3 acres wide, clear water ringed by old oak trees, right where the newer houses now stood. In the early 2000s, when the housing market took off, developers filled it in to make way for 6 new homes. That pond Shelley kept claiming to protect didn't even exist anymore, buried under suburban lawns and driveways 15 years before she even moved in. Nora had even more than just official records to share. "I remember the day they brought in the dump trucks," she said, shaking her head. "Half of us were crying, but the other half were excited about rising property values." The HOA back then was run by developers who promised those new houses would enhance community character. What a load of nonsense. She showed me photos of the trucks dumping dirt and gravel into what used to be sparkling water. Mrs. Martha Henderson, who lived on the edge of our community, had cried for a week when they cut down those old oaks. But here's where things got really interesting. I found out that the Hendersons still owned a 3-acre plot with a gorgeous natural pond. Frank and Martha Henderson were both in their late 70s, thinking about moving to Florida to be near their grandkids. According to Nora, they'd been growing more and more frustrated with the HOA's petty rules. Just last month, Shelley had cited them for excessive noise because their dog barked whenever someone walked past their fence. The more I heard about the Hendersons, the clearer my plan became. That evening, I decided to pay them a visit. Frank answered the door, a tall, weathered man with kind eyes and hands that told a lifetime of honest work. When I introduced myself as the guy in the fight with that crazy whole lady, his face lit up like it was Christmas morning. "You're the fishing fellow," he exclaimed, calling for Martha to join us. "Martha, come here. This is the man with the sign about cartons." They welcomed me in for coffee. And it was obvious right away that these were good people who'd been pushed around one too many times by power-hungry neighbors. As we sat in their kitchen, overlooking their beautiful pond, Frank told me about the endless hassle with Shelley. She'd been after them for months, nagging about everything from their mailbox height to the color of their garden hose. That woman has made our lives miserable, Martha said, shaking her head. We've lived here peacefully for 25 years, and now we can't even enjoy our own backyard. A broken bar without worrying about what ridiculous rule we're supposedly breaking. When I asked about their plans to move to Florida, Frank's eyes took on a faraway look. We've been thinking about it more and more, he said, his voice soft, especially after dealing with that Voss woman. We just want some peace in our golden years. That's when I made them an offer they couldn't refuse. I laid out everything, how Shelley was making fake claims about community ponds and how I was pretty sure she didn't even know where the real community pond had once been. Then I asked them, would they be willing to sell me their property so I could give a certain HOA president a lesson she'd never forget. The look that passed between Frank and Martha was pure mischief. Son, Frank said with a grin, if buying this place helps you take down that witch, we'll give you the best deal you've ever seen. As I drove home that night, I couldn't stop grinning. Shelley had called an emergency community meeting for the next night, planning to reveal her so-called evidence against me. She had no clue that I just bought the perfect weapon to bring to that meeting. By the time I signed the final paperwork for the Henderson property, I was practically giddy thinking about the look on her face. We pushed the Henderson sale through at lightning speed because Shelley's meeting was looming. Frank and Martha were so thrilled to move to Florida and stick it to Shelley that they agreed to wrap up the deal by 5 p.m. on the day of the meeting. That's when I officially became the owner of the most beautiful 3-acre pond in the county. And Shelley, she still didn't have a clue. The community center was packed that night. Word had spread fast about the so-called environmental crisis on my property, and people were dying to see what the fuss was all about. Shelley had clearly spent hours rehearsing. She had a laptop, a projector, and a stack of papers thicker than a phone book. She was wearing her best attempt at a fictional navy blazer that didn't fit right and a clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. Roy was sitting in the front row, looking like he was about to be sick. All around me, neighbors were whispering and wondering whether to believe Shelley's wild claims. I walked in about 5 minutes late and found a seat in the back. Shelley's eyes locked on me the moment I stepped inside, and a triumphant smile spread across her face. She thought this was her big moment to publicly humiliate me and paint herself as the environmental champion of the neighborhood. What she didn't know was that in my jacket pocket, I had a deed to the real community pond and a plan to turn her grand performance into a spectacular flop. Shelley launched into her presentation like a prosecutor making a closing argument. She'd put together a PowerPoint filled with dramatic photos of me fishing, red arrows pointing at violations, and captions warning of environmental terrorism and community threats. She even threw in some impressive-looking charts, claiming my fishing had poisoned the whole watershed. The whole thing was so overblown I had to bite my cheek to keep from laughing. She was pacing back and forth, gesturing like she was rallying a jury. This man, she declared, pointing right at me, has shown total disregard for our community's environmental safety. His reckless fishing has created dangerous contamination levels that threaten our health, our homes, and our property values. I could feel the room shifting as she spoke. Some neighbors nodded along, but others were starting to look skeptical. Nora, bless her, was in the middle section, asking polite questions like, what exactly makes fishing so dangerous? And have these water samples been tested by an actual lab? Roy's part in the presentation was especially painful. Shelley had clearly drilled him on what to say, but he looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. When she asked him to confirm her findings, he fumbled through his lines like a kid in a school play. Yes, the measurements were, broken bar very concerning, he stammered, eyes glued to the floor. The, levels were definitely elevated. Anyone paying attention could see Roy was only there because Shelley had pushed him into it. Then came Shelley's big finish, her list of demands. Given the severity of these violations, she announced, I'm recommending a $2,500 fine, a public apology, and a permanent fishing ban on all community waterways. The room went dead quiet. $2,500 was no joke. And even the people who'd been eating up Shelley's story looked startled by how extreme she was being. That's when I stood up and dropped my bombshell. Shelley, I think we should all go see this community pond you're so worried about. Let's meet there tomorrow afternoon so everyone can see for themselves exactly what you're talking about." The look on her face was worth every minute of the hassle. She thought I was falling right into her trap of volunteering for a public shaming at the so-called crime scene. "Absolutely," she said, practically bouncing with excitement. "Everyone should see the damage he's done to our precious community waterway." As the meeting wrapped up, I shook Shelley's hand and said I was looking forward to our pond visit. She had no idea she just signed up for her own public downfall. For the pond visit she had no clue she just agreed to her own public execution. That night, I barely slept, not from nerves, but because I was so excited about what was going to happen the next day. I'd spent 2 years on my ranch, learning to appreciate the slow, peaceful rhythms of nature. But tomorrow was going to be anything but slow and peaceful. It was going to be the day Shelley Voss found out what happens when you mess with the wrong person's property rights. Lying there in the dark, I couldn't help but think about why I'd come out here in the first place. After 15 years in the corporate world building and selling my tech startup, I was burned out on endless meetings, endless noise, and the endless games that never seemed to achieve anything real. I'd bought this ranch because I wanted quiet. I wanted to wake up to birdsong instead of honking horns, to watch the sunrise over water instead of staring at a computer screen. The irony wasn't lost on me that my search for tranquility had landed me in the biggest fight of my adult life. I got to the Henderson place early the next day, determined to make sure everything was perfect for the showdown. Frank and Martha had already moved most of their stuff down to Florida, but they'd left behind a folding table and a few chairs just for this event. "We wouldn't miss this for the world," Martha had told me on the phone. "We're driving back from Florida just to watch that awful woman get what's coming to her." The pond was breathtaking in the afternoon light. Crystal clear water reflected the towering oaks overhead, and a little dock stretched out over the water, perfect for fishing. There wasn't a single sign of the environmental disaster Shelley had been ranting about. People started trickling in around 3 p.m. I'd invited the whole neighborhood to what I was calling the pond inspection, and the turnout was even better than I'd hoped. Nora was there with her camera. Curious neighbors brought their kids. A few people from outside the neighborhood had even shown up, having heard about the drama and wanting to see it for themselves. You could see it in their face as a confusion. This was not what Shelley had described. This was nothing like the doomsday scenario she'd painted at the meeting. Bob Williams, the neighborhood challenged Shelley's testing, showed up with his whole family. "I had to see this for myself," he told me. "After seeing her test your lake water like it was diabetes, I figured this would be worth watching." His wife Sarah had brought a lawn chair and a cooler, clearly planning to stay for the whole show. Even old Mr. Peterson had hobbled over with his walker, muttering about how this was finally some real entertainment. Shelley showed up fashionably late, obviously thinking she was going to make a grand entrance. She had Roy with her, plus her clipboard and camera ready to document what she thought was going to be my public embarrassment. But as soon as she got out of the car, I saw the confusion start to cloud her face. This wasn't my property. This wasn't the lake she'd cited me for fishing. She looked around like she was trying to get her bearings. "What is this place?" she asked, glancing around nervously. "This isn't where we were supposed to meet." That's when I dropped the first bomb. "Actually, Shell," I said, "this is exactly where we were supposed to meet. This is the real community pond." I pulled out the Henderson property deed, signed just 2 days earlier, and held it up for everyone to see. "I did a little research after your presentation last night. Turns out, our community did have a pond at this pond. The original community pond that got filled in back in 2003 to make room for more houses." The crowd was catching on. People were pulling out their phones, ready to record whatever was about to happen. Sarah Williams let out a loud gasp. "Do you bought the Henderson place? But what about Frank and Martha?" I smiled and gestured toward the elderly couple who were getting out of their car, both of them grinning like they'd just won the lottery. "They're moving to Florida to be closer to their grandkids," I said. "And they were more than happy to sell to someone who appreciates what this property means." Frank gave the crowd a little wave like he was on stage at an award show. You could tell he was loving every second of it. Shelley's face went through about 6 different expressions in the span of 10 seconds. Confusion, disbelief, anger, panic, and finally a kind of stubborn defiance that told me she'd rather double down on her lies than admit she'd been wrong. "That's impossible," she sputtered. "This is fraud. You can't just buy community property and claim it's yours." But Nora was ready. She'd brought copies of old meeting minutes, photos from the community archives, and statements from longtime residents who remembered fishing here as kids. Roy, meanwhile, was a broken bar having what could only be described as a complete moral meltdown. Watching Shelley scramble to explain away the obvious truth finally seemed to shatter something inside him. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "Shell, you made me fake those documents. You made me lie about the water testing. None of it was real." The silence that followed was deafening. Roy's confession had shifted everything. This wasn't just a dispute about property lines or HOA rules. This was about systematic fraud and deliberate deception. But I wasn't finished yet. I reached behind me and pulled out a wooden sign I'd had made that very morning. It was a beautifully crafted placard that read, "Private property entry by HOA officials prohibited." "You see, Shell," I said, gesturing to the pond, "you kept going on about community water and environmental protection. Well, guess what? You got your wish. This is community water again." I paused, letting the moment sink in. "The only problem I own it now, and as the legal owner, I'm officially banning you from ever setting foot here again." The reaction from the crowd was everything I'd hoped for and more. Some people laughed out loud, others clapped, a few just stood there in shock, trying to wrap their heads around what they were seeing. Shelley's face was turning red as she sputtered, trying to salvage some shred of authority. But it was too late. The truth was out. Her lies had been exposed, and everyone could see exactly who she really was. I hammered the sign into the ground by the pond, then turned back to her with a smile. "You wanted oversight of the community's water, Shell? Well, congratulations. You've got it," Shelley practically shrieked, promising to go to the media, calling it fraud and threatening lawsuits. That was perfect. I'd been counting on her to escalate things in public. There's nothing like having a bully's behavior broadcast for everyone to see. Sure enough, the next morning, I got a call from Jessica Martinez, a reporter from our local news station. "Mr. Morgan," she said, "I've been contacted by a Shelley Voss, who claims you're running some kind of real estate scam and have stolen community property. She's provided what she says is evidence of environmental crimes and fraud. Would you like to comment?" I could barely keep the excitement out of my voice. "Absolutely," I told her. "I'd be happy to share my side of the story along with some documentation I think you'll find interesting." We arranged to meet that afternoon at the pond for what I described as a press conference to set the record straight. That morning, I got to work preparing a set of visual evidence boards that would tell the whole story, step by step. A timeline with photos showing the original community pond and its filling in 2003, copies of Shelley's absurd citations and her fake environmental authority, screenshots of Roy's confession, admitting he'd been forced to falsify documents, and most importantly, the property deed, proving I'd bought the Henderson land fair and square. I even threw in some of Shelley's old ads for her failed life coaching buzziness just to give people some context about who she was. Jessica and her cameraman arrived around 2 p.m. I could see right away that she smelled a great story. Local news always loves a tale of shady HOA drama with a clear villain. As the cameraman set up, Jessica started going through my evidence boards, her eyebrows climbing higher with every new detail. "This is incredible," she said, holding up one of Shelley's handwritten citations. "She actually tried to fine you for fishing on your own property?" I showed her the photos of Shelley's fake hazmat suit investigation, and she burst out laughing. Then I walked her through the timeline of how Shelley had systematically targeted families, using fake regulations and intimidation tactics to boost her own ego. "The really sad part," I told Jessica, "is that she convinced people she was protecting the environment, when she was really just harassing her neighbors for her own benefit." Jessica was already scribbling notes furiously, crafting the story in her head. Meanwhile, the cameraman got some great footage of the pond, the HOA officials' banned sign, And the old community photos Nora had dug up. Roy even showed up uninvited. Exactly what I'd hoped would happen. He must have seen the TV van and decided it was time to come clean publicly. His confession on camera was even more powerful, a broken bar more damning than anything he'd said at the pond. She threatened my job if I didn't go along with her schemes. Roy confessed to Jessica. She made me sign fake documents, lie to community members, and pretend those bogus tests were real science. I knew it was wrong, but I was scared of her and needed a paycheck. Watching Roy finally tell the truth was like watching someone shed 100-pound weight. You could practically see the relief washing over him. Nora showed up with a handful of other longtime residents, each eager to share their own stories of Shell's harassment campaigns. Mrs. Patterson spoke about getting cited for having the wrong color garden hose. Mr. Johnson described being fined for parking his truck in his own driveway aisle because it supposedly didn't meet aesthetic standards. Bob Williams recounted the absurd scene of Shelley testing lake water with pool chemicals. Piece by piece, the picture of Shelley's reign became crystal clear. A woman who had systematically terrorized an entire community, using fake authority and phony citations to bully anyone who got in her way. Jessica was scribbling notes as fast as she could, clearly realizing this was a far bigger story than she'd imagined. Her cameraman captured everything at the beautiful pond that Shelley claimed didn't exist, the historical photos of the real community pond's location, and the genuine relief and anger in people's voices. It was like she was running some kind of protection racket. Bob Williams said to the camera, "Pay up or get harassed until you move away." Even Frank and Martha Henderson joined in via video call from Florida, explaining how Shell's endless harassment had driven them to leave the home they'd lived in for 25 years. That evening, the story aired on the 6 o'clock news. The headline read, "HOA President's Fishing Fraud Exposed." They showed footage of the pond, interviewed neighbors about Shell's years-long harassment, and featured Roy's confession about forging documents under duress. The segment ended with me standing by my HOA officials banned sign, explaining how sometimes you have to fight back against bullies using their own tactics. Within hours, other local stations picked up the story, and it spread across social media like wildfire. But the best part was watching Shell's meltdown in real time. According to Nora, who lived across the street, Shell spent the evening frantically calling the TV station, demanding retractions and threatening lawsuits. She even posted a long, rambling rant on her personal social media, claiming the whole thing was a hit job by wealthy outsiders trying to destroy community values. The more she ranted, the more unhinged she sounded. Neighbors reported seeing her pacing around her house at all hours, talking loudly on her phone and gesturing at anyone who walked by. The community's response was swift and decisive. By the next morning, I had dozens of messages from neighbors apologizing for ever doubting me and thanking me for standing up to her. Even better, talk had already started about an emergency home meeting to remove Shell from her position and investigate her other alleged violations. After months of Shell terrorizing the community, she was finally going to see what real accountability looked like. Yeah, and it was all happening exactly the way she tried to avoid. In front of everyone, the HOA called an emergency vote for the next evening. I woke up that morning feeling like a kid on Christmas Day. Justice was finally coming. The meeting was set for 7 p.m. at the community center, and word had spread fast. People who hadn't cared about HOA politics for years were coming out of the woodwork to see the showdown. Even a few folks from neighboring communities showed up, drawn by what social media had dubbed Pondgate. When I arrived, the community center was packed, a standing room only. The energy in the room was electric. People were buzzing about the news coverage, Roy's confession, and Shell's insane social media rants. Shelley walked in about 10 minutes late, clearly hoping to make some sort of dramatic entrance, but the second she stepped through the door, the room fell dead silent. No greetings, no smile, just an uncomfortable hush that told her everything she needed to know. Roy, reinstated as HOA secretary under emergency provisions, was clearly relishing his role in Shelley's downfall. He read the charges against her in a calm, steady voice, so different from the nervous stammering we were used to hearing. Falsification of official documents, harassment of community members, abuse of authority, misrepresentation of HOA powers, he announced. The board recommends immediate removal from office and a full investigation of other potential violations. Shelley tried to interrupt a few times, but the room's hostility was so thick you could practically taste it. When she finally got a chance to speak, her defense was exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd completely lost touch with reality. She claimed I had orchestrated an elaborate conspiracy against her. She said Roy was lying about the document falsification, and that the community was being duped by the tricks of a wealthy outsider. She even accused me of illegally buying the property, insisting the real community pond was still my private lake. It was painful to watch, like seeing someone caught in their own web of lies, a broken bar, like watching someone dig their own grave while insisting they were building a swimming pool. The vote wasn't even close. 37 votes to remove Shelley from office, with only 2 abstentions and not a single vote in her favor. The moment Roy announced the results, the room erupted in applause that lasted nearly a full minute. Shelley sat there, stunned. Then she gathered her things and walked out without saying another word. Through the community center windows, we watched her sit in her car for almost 20 minutes, probably trying to process the collapse of her carefully crafted kingdom of fake authority. But the best was yet to come. As the meeting wrapped up, I stood and made an announcement I'd been planning for days. I'd like to invite everyone in the community to a celebration at my pond this Saturday, I said. We're going to have a barbecue, some fishing, and a proper party to mark what happens when a community stands up to bullies together. Everyone's welcome. I paused for effect. Except former HOA presidents who've been banned from the property. The laughter that followed was worth every penny I'd spent on the Henderson place. That Saturday, the pond party was absolutely perfect. Barbecue smoke drifted across the water as kids splashed in the shallows and adults cast fishing lines from the dock. Frank and Martha Henderson even drove up from Florida to join us, sharing stories about their new retirement community and how happy they were to have sold their home to someone who truly cared about it. You know, Martha said, watching kids play in the water where she'd learned to fish 60 years ago, this pond is finally being loved the way it was meant to be. Roy brought his kids, who were thrilled to fish in a pond without worrying about ridiculous citations. Nora turned the party into an impromptu history lesson, setting up a photo display that showed how the original pond had always been the heart of the community. This is what we lost when they filled in the first pond, she told a group of fascinated children. But now, it's back thanks to someone who understood what it really meant. The kids especially loved hearing that their grandparents might have fished in the same pond when they were young, creating a special connection across generations. Throughout the afternoon, cars kept creeping past, slowing down to watch the festivities. At least 6 times, I spotted a familiar Honda Civic idling by. Each time Shelley's car appeared, party guests would wave and point at the HOA officials' band signal, which had become something of a local landmark. Bob Williams had brought a cooler full of beer and was holding court near the grill, entertaining anyone who'd listen with increasingly dramatic retellings of Shelley's pond investigations. She was out there testing that water like she was trying to diagnose a kidney infection, he declared, causing another round of laughter. The final chapter of Shelley's story played out over the following weeks. Faced with potential legal action for document fraud and harassment, she quietly put her house on the market and moved away. The for sale sign in her yard became a sort of community milestone, especially after someone anonymously added a small placard underneath that read, "Former HOA." Her house sat on the market for months, eventually selling for well below asking price to a young family who were just happy to find a bargain, blissfully unaware of the property's infamous history. As for me, I went back to my peaceful morning fishing routine, but now, I understood how quickly tranquility can be disrupted by people who mistake authority for wisdom. My pond has become an unofficial community gathering spot. Neighbors drop by to fish, chat, and remember the time we all learned that the best way to deal with a bully is to let them defeat themselves. Every morning, as I cast my line into the calm water, I remember that some battles are worth fighting, especially when victory tastes as sweet as justice served with a side of property ownership. Nora often stops by in the evenings, sharing stories about the days when the original community pond was the heart of neighborhood life. You know, she said to me just last week, watching the sunset reflect on the water, this pond was always meant to bring people together. It just took the right person to make it happen again. As kids from the neighborhood splash in the same shallows where Martha Henderson learned to fish 70 years ago, I realized that sometimes the best revenge isn't just getting even, it's restoring something beautiful that was lost. If you enjoyed watching a Karen get exactly what she deserved, make sure to hit that like button and tell me in the comments the most ridiculous HOA story you've ever heard. At HOA Stories, we don't just tell stories, we let the chaos speak for itself.